The frozen wind cut across the cockpit like 1,000 tiny knives as Captain James Morrison gripped the control yoke of his B-24 Liberator with hands that had long since lost feeling. The instrument panel before him told a story of cascading failures, oil pressure dropping on engine 3, hydraulic fluid leaking somewhere in the starboard wing, and the altimeter showing a steady descent that no amount of throttle adjustment seemed to arrest. Behind him, through the narrow passage that connected the cockpit to the bomb bay and rear compartments, he could hear the laboured breathing of his crew over the intercom, punctuated by the occasional curse or prayer. It was February 1944, and they were somewhere over northern Finland, far from their base in England, and even farther from the target they had been sent to destroy. The mission had been cursed from the start. Intelligence had promised clear skies and minimal resistance, but the moment they crossed into enemy territory, the clouds had rolled in like a grey woolen blanket, and the flak had started coming up in sheets of black smoke and shrapnel. Morrison had watched 3 other bombers from their formations spiral down in flames before they even reached the target. Now, with 2 engines damaged and fuel streaming from a punctured tank, he knew they would never make it home. In the co-pilot's seat beside him, Second Lieutenant David Chen stared at the charts spread across his lap with an expression that wavered between concentration and barely suppressed panic. Chen was young, maybe 23, and this was only his 5th mission. His hands trembled slightly as he traced their position with a pencil, recalculating their trajectory over and over, as if hoping the mathematics would suddenly improve their situation. "We're not going to make Sweden," Chen said, his voice tight. "Even if we could maintain altitude, which we can't, we don't have the fuel." Morrison didn't respond immediately. He was watching the altimeter spin downward through 8,000 feet, then 7,500. The aircraft shuddered as another burst of wind caught them, and he could feel the sluggish response in the controls. They were losing lift, becoming less an aircraft and more a falling brick with wings. Behind them, in the navigator's compartment, Technical Sergeant Robert Fletcher hunched over his maps and instruments with the single-minded focus of a man who refused to accept defeat. Fletcher was 31, ancient by aircrew standards, a former merchant marine who had volunteered for the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor. He had a wife and 2 children back in Boston, and he carried their photographs in a waterproof pouch inside his flight suit. He had shown those photographs to Morrison once, during a quiet moment between missions, and Morrison had seen in the older man's eyes a determination that went beyond mere duty or patriotism. Fletcher was fighting to get home to those faces in the photographs. "Captain," Fletcher's voice crackled over the intercom, steady despite the circumstances. "I've got something. There's a lake about 20 miles northeast, big enough to set down on if it's frozen solid." Morrison exchanged a glance with Chen. Landing a B-24 on a frozen lake was not something covered in the training manuals. The aircraft weighed 36,000 pounds empty, much more with whatever fuel and ammunition they had left. If the ice wasn't thick enough, they would punch through and sink like a stone. If it was thick enough, but uneven, they could cartwheel and disintegrate. And even if they managed a perfect landing, they would be stranded in enemy territory, dozens of miles from any hope of rescue. "How big?" Morrison asked. "Maybe 2 miles long, half a mile wide. Could be bigger, hard to tell with the cloud cover." Morrison looked out at the landscape below them, what little he could see through the breaks in the clouds. It was a wilderness of snow-covered forest and frozen waterways, unmarked by roads or settlements. The temperature outside was probably 20 below zero, maybe colder. Without shelter, they would freeze to death in hours. In the tail gunner's position, Staff Sergeant Anthony Russo huddled behind his twin 50 caliber machine guns and tried not to think about how cold it was. Russo was 19, a kid from Brooklyn who had lied about his age to enlist. He had joined the Air Forces because it seemed more glamorous than slogging through mud as an infantryman, but there was nothing glamorous about freezing to death in the tail of a dying bomber. He could see the damage to the starboard wing from his position, the jagged holes punched through the aluminum skin by German flak, the dark streaks of oil staining the metal. One of the shells had nearly torn the wing off entirely. It was a miracle they were still flying at all. "We gonna make it, Sergeant Fletcher?" Russo's voice over the intercom sounded younger than his 19 years. Fletcher didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was carefully neutral. "We're working on it, kid. Just stay sharp." In the waist gunner positions, 2 more men waited in tense silence. Technical Sergeant William Hayes stood at the port gun, his eyes scanning the clouds for any sign of German fighters. Hayes was 26, a former auto mechanic from Detroit who could fix almost anything with enough time and the right tools. He had kept this aircraft flying through a dozen missions, patching holes, jury-rigging systems, coaxing performance from engines that should have quit long ago. But even Hayes knew there were limits to what mechanical ingenuity could accomplish. You couldn't fix gravity, and you couldn't fix an aircraft that was running out of sky. Across from Hayes, Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski manned the starboard gun. Kowalski was 28, quiet and competent, the kind of man who did his job without complaint and never caused trouble. Before the war, he had worked in his father's bakery in Milwaukee, getting up at 4 in the morning to knead dough and tend the ovens. He had planned to take over the business someday, marry his high school sweetheart, raise a family. The war had put those plans on hold, maybe forever. He tried not to think about that as he watched the damaged wing flex and groan with each gust of wind. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft, hanging in his plexiglass sphere like a man suspended in space, Technical Sergeant Eddie Martinez tracked the ground, rising up to meet them with a fatalistic calm. Martinez was 25, from a small town in New Mexico, where the sky was so big and empty you could see forever. He had always loved flying, loved the feeling of being untethered from the earth. Now that feeling terrified him. The ball turret was a death trap in the best of circumstances. If they crashed, he would have maybe 3 seconds to crank himself out before impact. He didn't like his odds. "Captain," Martinez's voice was tight, "we're down to 5,000 feet. Morrison pulled back on the yoke, trying to coax more altitude from the struggling engines, but the aircraft barely responded. The 2 remaining engines on the port wing screamed in protest, pushed beyond their design limits, while the damaged starboard engines sputtered and coughed. Black smoke streamed from engine 3, and Morrison knew it was only a matter of time before it seized completely, or, worse, caught fire. "Fletcher, give me a heading to that lake," Morrison said. "Chen, calculate our glide ratio. I want to know how much altitude we're going to need." The co-pilot's hands moved across his flight computer, his lips moving silently as he ran the numbers. "At our current rate of descent, we need to be at 3,000 feet minimum when we reach the lake. That gives us about 1 pass to get it right." 1 pass. Morrison felt the weight of that reality settle over him like a shroud. In normal circumstances, landing a B-24 required a careful approach, multiple adjustments, a gradual descent to a prepared runway. They would have none of that. They would come in fast and steep, and they would either stick the landing or they would die. There would be no go-around, no second chances. "All crew, this is Morrison," he said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his gut. "We're going to attempt an emergency landing on a frozen lake. When I give the word, I want everyone in crash positions. Ball turret, get yourself out of there and strap in. Tail gunner, move forward to the waist. We're going to be coming in hard." There was a moment of silence as the implications of his words sank in, and then the intercom erupted with a chorus of acknowledgements. Morrison heard the mechanical whine of the ball turret rotating as Martinez cranked himself out, heard the shuffle of boots as Russo abandoned his position in the tail and made his way forward. Through it all, Fletcher's voice remained calm and precise, calling out headings and distances like a man guiding a ship through a narrow channel. "Come right to 045. Lake should be visible in about 8 minutes if the clouds break." Morrison banked the aircraft gently, feeling the sluggish response, the way the damaged wing wanted to drop. He compensated with the ailerons, but he could feel the control cables stretching, the metal fatiguing. Everything about this aircraft was on the verge of catastrophic failure. They were flying on borrowed time, and the debt was coming due. Chen stared at the fuel gauges with something approaching despair. "We're almost dry on the starboard tanks. Port side has maybe 20 minutes left." 20 minutes. Morrison did the math in his head. They might make the lake with 5 minutes to spare, maybe less. If they had to circle even once to line up their approach, they would run dry and drop like a stone. Everything depended on getting it right the first time. Outside the cockpit windows, the clouds began to thin, revealing glimpses of the landscape below. Morrison saw forests thick with snow-laden pines, frozen rivers snaking between the trees, and then, ahead and slightly to the right, a vast expanse of white that could only be the lake Fletcher had found. It looked impossibly small from their altitude, a pale oval surrounded by dark forest, but as they descended it grew larger, revealing itself to be perhaps 3 miles long and a mile wide at its widest point. The surface appeared smooth and unbroken, covered in a thick blanket of snow that sparkled in the weak afternoon light. "There it is," Chen breathed. "Jesus, it looks tiny." Morrison didn't respond. He was already planning his approach, calculating angles and distances, trying to remember everything he had been taught about emergency landings. The key was to bleed off speed gradually, to touch down as slowly as possible while maintaining enough lift to keep the nose up. Too fast, and they would skip across the ice like a thrown stone, probably cartwheeling into the trees. Too slow, and they would stall, dropping the last 100 feet in an uncontrolled fall that would crumple the fuselage like tinfoil. "Fletcher, what's the wind?" "Light and variable, maybe 5 knots from the northwest." That was something, at least. A strong crosswind would have made the landing nearly impossible, but 5 knots he could handle. Morrison began his descent, spiralling down in a wide circle that brought them over the lake at 2,000 feet. From this height, he could see more details. The ice appeared solid, but there were darker patches near the centre that might be thin spots or water seeping up through cracks. He would have to aim for the southern end, where the ice looked thickest and most uniform. "All crew, brace for landing. This is going to be rough." He could hear them moving behind him, could picture them strapping into whatever seats they could find, could imagine the fear on their faces. These were good men, all of them. They had flown through hell together, had trusted him to bring them home. Now he was about to bet all their lives on a frozen lake in the middle of enemy territory. Morrison dropped the landing gear, felt the heavy thunk as the wheels locked into position, and immediately regretted it. The added drag caused the aircraft to slow abruptly, and he had to push the throttle forward on the remaining engines to maintain airspeed. But they needed the gear down. Landing on the belly would be suicide on ice. The friction would either flip them or break the aircraft in half. With the gear down, at least they had a chance, however slim, of staying upright. The altimeter unwound through 1,000 feet, then 800. Morrison could see individual trees now, could see the way the snow had drifted against the shoreline, could see what looked like the remains of a dock jutting out from the western shore. Someone had lived here once, or fished here. The thought was oddly comforting. If people had been here, there might be a cabin nearby, some form of shelter where they could wait out the cold until rescue arrived. If rescue arrived. Chen was gripping the edge of his seat so tightly his knuckles had gone white. 500 feet. Morrison pulled back on the throttle, letting the aircraft slow. He could feel it wallowing now, the wings losing lift, the nose wanting to drop. He eased back on the yoke, raising the nose, trying to stretch their glide. The trees at the southern end of the lake rushed toward them, impossibly tall, and for a moment Morrison was certain they were going to clip the tops. Then they were over the shore and above the ice, and he was cutting the throttle completely, pulling the nose up, praying the tail would clear. The main gear touched first with a jarring impact that sent a shockwave through the entire airframe. For one terrible second, Morrison thought the gear would collapse or punch through the ice, but they held. The aircraft bounced, lifting a few feet back into the air, and Morrison fought to keep the wings level. They came down again, harder this time, and he heard something snap in the starboard gear, felt the aircraft list to the right. He compensated with the rudder, trying to keep them straight, but they were sliding now, skidding across the ice at nearly 90 miles per hour with no way to stop. The nose gear touched down and immediately began to shimmy, vibrating so violently Morrison thought his teeth would shake loose. He could see the far end of the lake approaching fast, could see the trees that marked the northern shore growing larger by the second. They needed to slow down, needed to stop, but there was nothing to stop them. No brakes would work on ice this smooth. They were a 36,000-pound projectile with no way to arrest their momentum. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Morrison shouted into the intercom. The aircraft continued its terrifying slide across the lake, spinning slightly to the right as the damaged starboard gear dragged. Morrison could hear metal grinding, could smell burning rubber and hot hydraulic fluid. Behind him, someone was praying in rapid Spanish, Martinez probably, and someone else was cursing in a steady monotone. The trees grew larger, close enough now that Morrison could see individual branches, could imagine the sickening crunch of impact. And then, with perhaps 300 yards to spare, the friction of the gear and the drag of the damaged wing finally began to take effect. The aircraft slowed, the spinning lessened, and they came to a shuddering, groaning halt, maybe 200 yards from the northern shore. For a long moment, nobody moved. The sudden silence was deafening after the roar of the engines and the screaming of tortured metal. Morrison sat in his seat, hands still gripping the yoke, barely able to believe they were down and alive. "Sound off," he finally managed to croak. "Everybody okay?" One by one the voices came back over the intercom. Chen, his voice shaking. Fletcher, steady as always. Hayes, Kowalski, Martinez, Russo, all alive, all accounted for. Morrison felt something release in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't even known was there until it loosened. "Shut down all systems and get out," Morrison ordered. "I don't want anyone inside if this thing decides to sink or catch fire. Move." The crew didn't need to be told twice. Morrison heard them scrambling through the fuselage, gathering survival gear, pulling on extra layers of clothing. He went through the engine shutdown procedure mechanically, cutting fuel and ignition, making sure nothing was still running that could spark a fire. Beside him, Chen was already out of his seat and heading back toward the bomb bay. Morrison took one last look at the instrument panel, at the gauges and switches that had been his world for the past few hours, and then he followed. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he dropped through the hatch onto the ice. It was beyond anything he had experienced, a savage, bone-deep cold that made breathing painful and turned exposed skin numb in seconds. The wind, which had seemed light from the air, cut across the lake like razors, driving snow and ice crystals into his face. Morrison pulled his flight jacket tighter and looked around at his crew. They stood in a ragged cluster beside the aircraft, looking lost and vulnerable in the vast white emptiness of the frozen lake. Fletcher had already organized them into salvage parties, directing Hayes and Kowalski to pull supplies from the waste compartments, while Martinez and Russo gathered parachutes and blankets. Chen stood apart, staring back at the way they had come, at the long gouge their landing gear had carved across the ice. "We made it," Chen said, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We actually made it." Morrison followed his gaze and saw what Chen was seeing. The dark streak of disturbed snow and ice stretching back nearly a mile to the southern shore, the scattered debris from their damaged aircraft, the way the ice had cracked and buckled under the impact, but held. They had been lucky, incredibly, impossibly lucky. "For now," Morrison said quietly. "But we're a long way from home, and it's getting dark. Let's see what we can salvage and find some shelter before we freeze to death." Fletcher took charge of the salvage operation with the efficiency of a man who had spent years managing cargo holds and dangerous seas. Within 20 minutes, they had pulled everything useful from the aircraft: emergency rations, medical supplies, 2 Thompson submachine guns with ammunition, flares, a portable radio that may or may not still work, and, most importantly, the survival tent and sleeping bags stored in the rear compartment. Morrison watched his navigator work with quiet admiration. While some men fell apart in crisis, Fletcher seemed to grow calmer and more focused, as if the presence of clear danger clarified his thinking. "We need to get off this lake before dark," Fletcher said, slinging a pack over his shoulder. "The ice held, but I don't trust it, and if anyone saw us come down, they'll be looking for us." Morrison nodded. The sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. In these latitudes, darkness came early and stayed late. They had maybe an hour of good light left, 2 at most. "Any idea which direction?" Fletcher consulted the compass he wore on a cord around his neck. "South puts us deeper into Finland. North takes us toward the coast, but it's 100 miles minimum. Our best bet is west. If we can make 20 miles, we might reach the Swedish border, neutral territory." 20 miles in this cold, through forest, with no trail? Chen's voice rose slightly. "That's impossible." "Not impossible," Fletcher corrected. "Just very, very difficult. But staying here is certain death. We either move or we freeze." Russo, the youngest of the crew, looked back at the aircraft with something like longing. The B-24 had been their home for months, their protection, their way back to base. Now it sat broken and useless on the ice, already beginning to drift with snow as the wind picked up. "Shouldn't we try the radio? Call for help?" Hayes, the engineer, shook his head. "Radio's probably damaged from the landing. Even if it works, who's going to hear us out here? We're behind enemy lines, kid. The only people listening are Germans and Finns, and they're not coming to rescue us." "We try the radio anyway," Morrison decided. "Hayes, see if you can get it working. Russo, Martinez, start hauling the supplies toward shore. Kowalski, Chen, scout ahead and find us a path through those trees. Fletcher and I will check the aircraft one more time, make sure we didn't miss anything." The crew dispersed to their tasks, moving quickly despite their exhaustion. Morrison and Fletcher climbed back into the fuselage, using flashlights to illuminate the dim interior. The aircraft creaked and groaned around them, metal contracting in the cold. Morrison ran his hand along the bulkhead, feeling the patches and repairs that marked their previous missions. This aircraft had carried them through flak and fighters, through storms and mechanical failures. It seemed wrong to abandon it now. "She's done," Fletcher said quietly, as if reading Morrison's thoughts. "Even if we could repair her, we'd never get her off this lake. She's a tombstone now." Morrison found the aircraft's logbook in a storage compartment and tucked it inside his jacket. The logbook contained a record of every flight, every mission, every man who had flown in this aircraft. If they died out here, at least someone might find it someday and know what had happened. The thought was cold comfort. They climbed back out to find Hayes kneeling in the snow beside the portable radio, his bare hands working the connections despite the brutal cold. The radio operator looked up as they approached, his expression grim. "Transmitter's shot. Took damage when we hit. I might be able to jury-rig something, but it would take hours, and I'd need parts we don't have. Can it receive?" Hayes flipped a switch and was rewarded with a burst of static. He adjusted the frequency dial, and fragments of voices emerged from the white noise. German voices giving orders, reporting positions. Hayes quickly turned it off. "It receives fine, but that's not going to help us much." Morrison made a decision. "Leave it. We can't spare the weight, and if the Germans are using these frequencies, they'll triangulate our position the moment we transmit. Better to stay dark and move fast." By the time they reached the southern shore, full darkness had fallen. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Morrison could feel ice forming in his moustache with each breath. His feet were numb inside his boots, and his fingers felt thick and clumsy when he tried to work the buckles on his pack. Around him, the crew moved like ghosts through the trees, their breath forming white clouds in the beam of the flashlights. Chen and Kowalski had found a small clearing about 100 yards into the forest, sheltered from the wind by a dense stand of pines. It wasn't much, but it was better than the exposed shoreline. Fletcher immediately set about establishing a camp, directing the men to clear snow and set up the survival tent. The tent was designed for 4 people, but they would have to make it work for 7. Cramped quarters were better than freezing to death. Martinez and Russo gathered firewood, breaking dead branches from the lower parts of the trees. Morrison knew a fire was risky. The smoke could give away their position, but without it, they would be dead by morning. They would have to chance it and hope the darkness and the forest canopy would hide them. While the others worked, Kowalski stood at the edge of the clearing, his Thompson submachine gun cradled in his arms, watching the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Morrison joined him, stamping his feet to maintain circulation. "You think they saw us come down?" Kowalski asked quietly. "Probably," Morrison admitted. "A B-24 isn't exactly subtle, but whether they can find us in this terrain, in the dark, that's another question. We need to set a watch rotation, keep someone alert at all times." Kowalski nodded slowly. Before the war, he had never held a gun, never imagined he would be standing in a frozen forest in enemy territory, preparing to defend his life. The transformation still felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. "Captain, do you really think we can make it to Sweden?" Morrison wanted to lie, wanted to offer false reassurance, but Kowalski deserved better. "I think we have a chance. A small one, but a chance. That's more than a lot of crews get." The fire, when they finally got it lit, was a small miracle. Flames licked at the dry wood, spreading heat and light into their frozen world. The crew huddled around it, holding their hands out to the warmth, their faces emerging from shadow like survivors of some ancient disaster. Fletcher heated water in a borrowed canteen cup and distributed small portions of hot coffee from their emergency rations. It tasted terrible, but the warmth was intoxicating. They ate in silence, gnawing on hard biscuits and dried meat that had to be softened with hot water before it could be swallowed. The portions were small, calculated to last 3 days if they were careful, less if they had to exert themselves. Fletcher had already done the math, 20 miles to the border, maybe 5 miles a day if the terrain was difficult and the weather held. 4 days minimum, probably longer. "We're going to need more food," Hayes said, stating the obvious. "These rations won't last." "We'll forage," Fletcher replied. "Trap small game if we can. There are ways to survive in wilderness like this if you know what you're doing." "And do you? Know what you're doing?" Chen's question came out sharper than he probably intended, edged with fear and exhaustion. Fletcher looked at the young co-pilot steadily. "I've sailed the North Atlantic in winter. I've survived 3 days in a lifeboat after a U-boat attack. I know cold, and I know hunger, and I know how to stay alive when everything says you should be dead. So, yes, Lieutenant, I know what I'm doing. Question is, do you trust me?" Chen looked away, chastened. "I trust you." "Good. Because if we're going to survive this, we need to work together. No heroes, no quitters. We move as a unit. We make decisions together, and we don't leave anyone behind. Understood?" There were nods and murmured agreements around the fire. Morrison felt a surge of gratitude for Fletcher. The navigator was doing what Morrison should have done, establishing order, building morale, giving the men something to believe in besides their fear. Leadership came naturally to Fletcher in a way it never had to Morrison. Morrison could fly an aircraft, could make split-second decisions in combat, but this slow, grinding survival was Fletcher's domain. Russo spoke up from his position near the tent. "Sergeant Fletcher, what about the Finns? I heard they're not like the Germans. Some of them help downed Allied air crews." "Some do," Fletcher agreed. "Finland's technically fighting alongside Germany, but it's complicated. They're fighting Russia, not us. But we can't count on that. We have to assume anyone we meet is hostile until proven otherwise. Trust no one, stay alert, stay alive." The watch rotation was established. 2-hour shifts, 2 men at a time, positioned at opposite sides of the clearing with the Thompsons. Morrison took the first watch with Hayes, leaving the others to squeeze into the tent and try to sleep. The temperature continued to drop, and Morrison could hear the trees cracking in the cold, sharp reports like distant gunfire that made him flinch every time. Hayes sat with his back against a tree, the Thompson across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You ever think about what happens if we don't make it, Captain?" "Try not to," Morrison admitted. "I think about it all the time. I got a girl back home, Susan. We were supposed to get married after my tour. I keep thinking about her getting the telegram, the one that says missing in action, presumed dead. I keep thinking about her waiting, wondering, never knowing for sure." Morrison didn't have a good response to that. He thought about his own family, his mother in Ohio, who wrote him letters every week, his younger brother who had just enlisted and was training to be a pilot himself. What would they think when they heard? Would they hold out hope? Or would they assume the worst? "We're not dead yet," Morrison said finally. "And as long as we're alive, there's a chance we make it home." Hayes smiled grimly. "That's what I keep telling myself." The night stretched on, cold and dark and interminable. Morrison's watch ended, and he gratefully surrendered his position to Martinez and Kowalski, crawling into the tent to find a space between sleeping bodies. The tent was cramped and smelled of sweat and fear, but it was marginally warmer than outside. He wedged himself between Fletcher and Russo, pulled his sleeping bag up to his chin, and tried to sleep. His mind raced with plans and contingencies, calculating distances and risks, playing out scenarios both hopeful and grim. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of falling through ice into dark water. He woke to Fletcher shaking his shoulder. Pale grey light filtered through the tent fabric, signalling dawn. "We've got a problem," Fletcher said quietly. Morrison emerged from the tent to find the crew gathered around the remains of their fire, which had burned down to glowing embers during the night. Chen stood apart from the others, His arms wrapped around himself, shivering violently. His face was grey, and his lips had a bluish tinge that Morrison recognized immediately. Hypothermia, Fletcher confirmed. Early stages, but it'll get worse if we don't warm him up. He needs dry clothes, hot food, and rest. But we don't have time for rest. Morrison knelt beside Chen, taking the young man's hands in his own. The skin was cold and clammy, the fingers barely responsive. "David, can you hear me?" Chen's eyes focused slowly. "I'm okay. Just cold. I'll warm up once we start moving." "You're not okay," Morrison said bluntly. "Your body temperature is dropping. If we don't reverse this, you're going to die." "I'm not slowing everyone down," Chen protested weakly. "Leave me some supplies. Keep moving. I'll catch up when I'm warmer." "We're not leaving you." Morrison looked up at Fletcher. "How long to get him stable?" 2 hours minimum, maybe more. But, Captain, we need to move. Every hour we stay here is an hour the Germans have to organize search parties. If they find us..." Morrison understood the unspoken calculation. 7 men had a chance of making it to Sweden. 6 men, moving fast and light, had a better chance. 1 sick man changed the equation entirely, but Morrison had meant what he said in his speech the night before. No one gets left behind. We warm him up, we get food in him, and then we move together, Morrison decided. "Hayes, get that fire built back up. Russo, Martinez, melt snow for hot water. Kowalski, check our perimeter. Fletcher, inventory our supplies and tell me exactly what we have." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role. Hayes coaxed the embers back to life and fed the growing flames with small sticks until he had a respectable fire going. Russo and Martinez held canteens over the flames, melting snow and adding coffee grounds from their rations. Kowalski took his Thompson and disappeared into the trees, making a slow circuit of their camp. Fletcher spread their supplies on a ground sheet and began taking inventory. "We've got rations for 3 days, maybe 4 if we stretch them. 2 Thompsons, maybe 300 rounds total. 1 flare gun with 6 flares. Basic medical supplies. Bandages, sulfur powder, morphine. 3 compasses, 2 that work. Maps that are probably inaccurate. 6 sleeping bags, 1 tent. Matches, some rope, a hatchet. That's about it. No radio? Left it by the lake. Dead weight." Morrison nodded. They were travelling light, which was good. But light also meant vulnerable. If they ran into trouble, 2 submachine guns wouldn't count for much against a determined enemy. Their only real advantage was mobility and the element of surprise. Chen sipped the hot coffee slowly, wincing at the bitter taste, but drinking it anyway. Colour was returning to his face, and his shivering had lessened slightly. Morrison wrapped him in an extra sleeping bag and positioned him close to the fire. "Better?" "Better," Chen admitted. "Captain, I'm sorry. I should have—" "Don't," Morrison cut him off. "You didn't do anything wrong. This could happen to any of us. The cold out here doesn't care about rank or experience, it just kills." Kowalski returned from his patrol, his expression troubled. "Captain, I found tracks. Human tracks. Maybe half a mile east. Fresh, probably made this morning. Someone's out here." The crew fell silent, all eyes turning to Morrison. He felt the weight of their expectations, their fear. They needed him to have answers, to know what to do. He stood, brushing snow from his flight suit, and tried to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Could be hunters, could be locals, could be a German patrol. Regardless, it means we're not alone out here, and we need to move. Now. "Chen, can you walk?" The co-pilot struggled to his feet, wobbling slightly but staying upright. "I can walk." "Then we pack up and we go, west toward the border. Fletcher, you navigate. Hayes and I will carry the supplies. Kowalski, you're on point with a Thompson. Russo, your rear guard with the other one. Martinez, help Chen if he needs it. We move fast, we move quiet, and we stop for nothing unless I say otherwise. Clear?" They broke camp in less than 10 minutes, scattering the fire and burying the ashes, erasing as much evidence of their presence as they could. It wouldn't fool a skilled tracker, but it might buy them a few hours. Morrison took one last look at the clearing where they had spent the night, then turned west and began walking. The forest closed in around them almost immediately, a maze of snow-covered pines and frozen undergrowth. The going was difficult, each step sinking 6 inches into the snow, each breath burning cold in their lungs. They travelled in single file, following Kowalski's lead, maintaining silence except for the crunch of their boots and the occasional crack of a breaking branch. Morrison walked near the middle of the line, close enough to keep an eye on Chen. The co-pilot was struggling, that much was obvious. His breathing came in short gasps, and he stumbled frequently, catching himself on trees. But he kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, driven by pride or stubbornness or fear. Morrison recognized the look. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning, the look of a man refusing to give up even when giving up would be easier. They had been walking for perhaps an hour when they heard the sound. It drifted through the trees from somewhere behind them, faint but unmistakable. Dogs barking. The barking grew louder, closer, and with it came the sound of men's voices shouting in what Morrison thought was Finnish. Kowalski stopped abruptly, raising his fist in the universal signal to halt. The crew froze, straining their ears, trying to gauge the distance. Maybe a mile, maybe less. In the stillness of the forest, sound travelled strangely, bouncing off trees, distorted by the wind. "They're tracking us," Russo whispered, his voice tight with panic. "They've got dogs on our trail." Fletcher pushed forward to Morrison's position, his face grim. "We can't outrun dogs, Captain. Not in snow this deep, not with Chen barely able to walk. We need to split up, give them multiple trails to follow." "No," Morrison said firmly. "We split up. We die separately. We stay together." "Then what?" Hayes demanded. "We can't fight them. 2 Thompsons against God knows how many soldiers with dogs? That's suicide." Morrison's mind raced through options, discarding them as quickly as they formed. Hayes was right. They couldn't fight. They couldn't outrun the pursuit. But maybe they could outsmart it. He looked around at the terrain, at the dense pines and the small frozen stream they had just crossed, and an idea began to form. "The stream," he said. "How far does it run?" Fletcher pulled out his map, studying it with practiced efficiency. "Maybe 3 miles before it joins a larger river. Why?" "Dogs track by scent. If we follow the stream bed, stay in the water where it's not frozen solid, we might break the trail. It'll be cold as hell, but it might work." Martinez shook his head. "Captain, that water is probably just above freezing. We go in there, we'll have hypothermia in minutes. All of us, not just Chen." "We'll have bullets in us if we don't," Morrison shot back. "I'm open to better ideas." No one spoke. The barking was definitely closer now, and Morrison could hear the crashing of brush as the pursuit party moved through the forest. They were running out of time. "Do it," Fletcher said quietly. "It's a calculated risk, but it's better than certain capture." They backtracked to the stream, a narrow ribbon of ice and dark water that cut through the forest like a scar. Morrison tested the ice at the edge with his boot and felt it crack immediately. The centre of the stream, where the current was fastest, remained unfrozen but looked numbingly cold. He took a deep breath and stepped in. The shock was instantaneous and overwhelming. The water came up to his knees, and it felt like 1,000 needles driving into his flesh. His legs went numb almost immediately, and he had to fight to keep his balance on the slippery rocks beneath the surface. Behind him, he heard the crew following, heard their gasps and curses as the cold bit into them. They moved as quickly as they could, stumbling over submerged rocks, fighting the current, their boots filling with water that sloshed with each step. Chen fell twice, and both times Martinez hauled him up, half carrying the younger man. Morrison's teeth chattered so hard he thought they might crack, and his hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to maintain his grip on his pack. They followed the stream for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 minutes. Behind them, the sound of the dogs grew confused, then faded. The dogs had lost the scent at the stream's edge, and were casting about, trying to pick it up again. Morrison allowed himself a small moment of hope. It had worked. They had bought themselves time. "Out!" Fletcher gasped. "We need to get out of the water before we all die of hypothermia." They scrambled up the far bank, their legs barely responding to commands, their clothing soaked and already beginning to freeze in the brutal cold. Morrison knew they had only minutes before the wet clothing became a death sentence. They needed fire, needed it immediately, regardless of the risk. Hayes, Martinez, gather wood, dry wood, from under the trees where the snow hasn't reached. Kowalski, find us some shelter. Russo, help me get Chen's wet clothes off before he freezes solid. They worked with desperate speed, no longer caring about noise discipline or leaving traces. Survival trumped stealth now. Hayes and Martinez returned with armfuls of relatively dry branches and pine needles, and within minutes, Hayes had coaxed a small flame to life using some of the precious matches from their emergency kit. The fire grew, spreading warmth into their frozen world, and the crew huddled around it like worshippers at an altar. Chen's lips were blue, and he was barely conscious. His wet clothing had frozen into a stiff shell, and his whole body convulsed with violent shivers. Morrison and Russo worked to strip the frozen garments off, replacing them with dry layers from their packs. There weren't enough dry clothes to go around, so the crew shared, layering whatever they had over Chen's trembling form. "Is he going to make it?" Russo asked quietly. Morrison honestly didn't know. Chen's breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin cold and clammy. These were all signs of severe hypothermia. Without proper medical care, he might slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. But Morrison couldn't say that. Not now. Not when morale was already hanging by a thread. "He's tough," Morrison said instead. "He'll pull through." They spent an hour by the fire, taking turns rotating positions so everyone could warm themselves. The dogs were silent now, and there were no sounds of pursuit. Either they had successfully thrown off the trackers, or the searchers had given up for the day. Morrison hoped for the former, but prepared for the latter. Fletcher studied his maps, while his clothes steamed in the heat. "We covered maybe 5 miles today. That leaves 15 to the border, assuming these maps are accurate, which they probably aren't. At this rate, 3 more days minimum." "We don't have 3 days of food," Hayes pointed out. "Then we forage, like I said. There are ways." Fletcher looked around at the crew, his expression serious. "But I need to be honest with you all. The next 72 hours are going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done. We're going to be cold, hungry, exhausted. Some of us might not make it, but if we work together, if we keep moving, we have a chance." "What kind of chance?" Chen asked weakly from his position near the fire. Fletcher considered the question. "In the merchant marine we had a saying, 'The ocean doesn't care about your odds. It only cares whether you quit or keep swimming.' Same principle applies here. The cold doesn't care. The Germans don't care. The only thing that matters is whether we give up or keep going. So what's it going to be?" Morrison looked around at his crew, at these men he had flown with and fought beside. He saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also determination. They had survived the impossible already, survived the flak and the crash, survived the frozen lake and the pursuit. They could survive this too. "We keep going," Morrison said. "At first light, we move west. We don't stop unless we have to, and we don't quit. Not now, not ever." The vote was unanimous. They travelled for 2 more days, pushing through the forest in a desperate race against cold and hunger and pursuing enemies. On the second day, they snared a rabbit using cordage from their parachutes and techniques Fletcher had learned from an Inuit sailor. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was protein, and they devoured it raw because they couldn't risk another fire. On the third day, Chen's condition worsened. He developed a fever, probably from an infection caused by the freezing water. He became delirious, mumbling about his family in California, about the girl he had left behind, about missions that had never happened. Martinez volunteered to carry Chen's pack, adding its weight to his own. When Chen could no longer walk unassisted, Kowalski and Hayes took turns supporting him, dragging him forward when he lost the ability to walk at all. Morrison wanted to call a halt, wanted to stop and care for the sick man properly. But stopping meant death, so they kept moving. On the morning of the 4th day, they found the border marker. It was nothing dramatic, just a weathered wooden post with faded paint marking the boundary between Finland and Sweden. But to the exhausted, frozen men who stumbled out of the tree line, it might as well have been the gates of heaven. They had made it. Against all odds, through cold and pursuit and near starvation, they had reached neutral territory. "We need to keep moving," Fletcher said, ever practical. "We're in Sweden, but we're still in the middle of nowhere. We need to find a town, find people who can help." They pressed on, following what looked like an old logging road that led deeper into Sweden. Within an hour, they encountered a Swedish border patrol, 3 men on skis, armed but not hostile. The Swedes took one look at the ragged, half-frozen men in American flight suits and immediately understood the situation. Within 2 hours, the crew was in a small border station, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot soup, while a Swedish doctor examined Chen. The doctor emerged from his examination with a grave expression. "The young one is very sick. Pneumonia, probably. He needs a hospital, antibiotics. But he will live, I think, if we can get him there quickly." Morrison felt something break inside him, some tightly wound spring that had been holding him together for the past 4 days. Chen would live. They all would live. The mission had failed. The aircraft was lost. But the men, his men, had survived. The Swedish authorities were courteous, but firm. As a neutral nation, Sweden couldn't simply release them back to Allied forces. They would be interned for the duration of the war, held in comfortable but supervised accommodations. It wasn't freedom, exactly, but it was safety. And after what they had been through, safety felt like the greatest luxury in the world. They spent 3 months in a Swedish internment camp near Stockholm, a camp that was more like a modest hotel than a prison. The rooms were heated, the food was regular and plentiful, and there were no bombs falling from the sky. Chen recovered slowly, spending 2 weeks in a hospital before rejoining the crew. The fever had damaged his lungs, and he would never fly combat missions again, but he was alive. In June of 1944, as the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Swedish government quietly allowed Morrison and his crew to escape. They were transported to the coast, put on a fishing boat, and delivered to British forces in Scotland, with a wink and a suggestion that they might want to avoid mentioning the specific details of their time in Sweden. Morrison returned to England to find that his crew had been listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Their aircraft had been spotted going down over Finland, and no distress signals had been received. A memorial service had already been held. His mother had received the telegram he had dreaded, the one that said her son was missing. His younger brother, training to be a pilot, had nearly washed out of the program, devastated by the news. The reunion was joyful but bittersweet. The crew was alive, but they had lost 4 months of the war. 4 months they could have been fighting. Morrison requested assignment to another bomber crew, but was denied. His experience and leadership were needed elsewhere, training new pilots, teaching them the lessons he had learned the hard way. Fletcher left the Army Air Forces and returned to his family in Boston. He never flew again, but he took a job with the Merchant Marine Service, coordinating logistics and supply lines. He carried the photographs of his wife and children until the day he died in 1987, an old man surrounded by grandchildren who listened in awe to his stories of survival. Hayes went back to Detroit and opened his own garage. He became moderately successful, known for his ability to fix anything mechanical and his habit of hiring returning veterans who needed work. He never talked much about the war, but he kept a photograph of the crew on his desk until the shop closed in 1979. Chen recovered from his pneumonia, but was medically discharged from the service. He returned to California, married his high school sweetheart, and became a teacher. He taught mathematics and physics for 37 years, and his students remembered him as demanding but fair, a man who never accepted excuses, but always believed in second chances. Kowalski returned to Milwaukee and took over his father's bakery as planned. The bakery became something of a local institution, known for its excellent bread and for the quiet, competent man who ran it. He married late in life at 42 to a widow who understood that some stories are too painful to tell. Martinez went back to New Mexico and became a pilot for a small commercial airline. He flew until he was 65, always most comfortable when he was in the air, suspended between earth and sky. He never married, but he was godfather to 14 children, beloved by all of them. Russo returned to Brooklyn and joined the police force. He served for 30 years, rising to the rank of sergeant. He was known for his calm under pressure, his ability to talk people down from desperate situations, his understanding that survival sometimes meant making impossible choices. Morrison continued to fly after the war, transitioning to civilian aviation and eventually becoming a test pilot for Boeing. He flew experimental aircraft, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, always searching for that feeling of control he had experienced in the cockpit of the B-24. He married twice, divorced twice, and died in 1992 at the age of 73, still reaching for the sky. The 7 men stayed in touch for the rest of their lives, gathering once a year in a different city to remember what they had survived together. At these gatherings, they would raise glasses to absent friends, to narrow escapes, to the frozen lake that had saved their lives and the forest that had nearly claimed them. They would tell the story again, embellishing some details, editing out others, but always returning to the central truth. They had survived because they refused to quit. The B-24 Liberator remained on the bottom of that frozen lake in Finland for decades, slowly settling through the ice as springs and summers came and went. In 1987, a Finnish fisherman discovered pieces of the wreckage. Local historians researched the find and identified the aircraft from its serial numbers. The Finnish government, in cooperation with the American embassy, recovered what remained and placed some of the pieces in a military museum in Helsinki. A plaque was installed near the site, commemorating the emergency landing and the crew's remarkable survival and escape. It reads, in Finnish, Swedish and English, "Here, in February 1944, 7 American airmen landed their damaged aircraft on frozen Lake Kallavesi. Through courage, resourcefulness and refusal to surrender, all 7 survived and reached safety. Their story reminds us that the human spirit, when tested, is capable of extraordinary things. 4 of the crew were still alive when the plaque was dedicated in 1989. Morrison, Fletcher, Hayes, and Martinez made the journey to Finland for the ceremony. Old men now, walking with canes, their backs bent but their eyes still sharp. They stood on the shore of the lake where they had crashed 45 years earlier and looked out across the water. In summer, the lake was beautiful, blue and calm, surrounded by green forest. It was hard to imagine it as the frozen hellscape they remembered. "We were so young," Martinez said quietly. "We were terrified," Fletcher added. "We were lucky," Hayes concluded. Morrison said nothing. He was thinking about Chen, who had passed away 2 years earlier, his damaged lungs finally giving out. He was thinking about Kowalski, who had died of a heart attack in 1985, and Russo, killed in the line of duty in 1974. He was thinking about all the men who hadn't made it home, all the crews that had gone down in flames or disappeared into the sea, all the stories that would never be told. "We did our duty," Morrison said finally. "That's all we could do. We did our duty and we took care of each other, and somehow we made it home. That has to be enough." The 4 old men stood together on the shore, remembering, and then they turned away from the lake and walked back toward the waiting cars. Behind them, the water lapped gently at the beach, and the wind moved through the trees, and the plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun, a testament to courage and survival and the bonds forged in the crucible of war. The story of the pilot who landed on a frozen lake to save his crew became part of the larger tapestry of World War II history, one small thread among millions, easily overlooked in the grand narrative of campaigns and battles. But for 7 men and their families, it was the story that mattered most. It was the story of how they survived the unsurvivable, how they found strength in each other when individual strength failed, and how they refused to let the cold and the darkness win. In the end, that was the only story that really mattered. Not the story of the war, not the story of victory or defeat, but the story of 7 men who looked death in the face and chose to keep walking, one frozen step at a time, until they found their way home.